folks, it's 1 o'clock, so why don't we get started. Let me introduce myself. First, before I even do that, we are recording this, so just so you guys know, and it'll be available afterwards at some point. My name is Paul Hacker. I'm a solution architect with Agile Thought, based out of Tampa. I live in Indy, and we're going to talk today about release management and team services. So I guess before we jump in, I'd like to get a show of hands of, is anybody using release management right now at all? A little bit, okay, a couple. The actual tool, release management, no. How about Visual Studio Team Services, VSTS? Yep, a few. How about TFS at all? Okay, a few. So wow, okay. So a lot to learn here. So if you want to get a hold of me, these are the best ways to get a hold of me. I've already recorded this session. I did it last week at a conference, so I already recorded this session. So if it's taking too long to get the one from Code on the Beach, just let me know and I'll give you a link to my my OneDrive, and you guys can download that video and see this whole presentation again. My blog, obviously, paulhacker.net, and my email is paul.hacker@agilethought.com. We are also looking for folks, so if anybody is interested in looking about working with DevOps or ALM, come see me afterwards. So the agenda is, let's talk about TFS and VSTS from the release management DevOps point of view. Let's talk about some DevOps practices, because it's great to have a release management tool, but really you have to define your practice to some degree. And then we'll go over an overview of the tooling itself, like what it is, the business value for having it, and then we'll compare it against other versions of the tool. In this case, nobody's really seemed to use the other tool, so, but we'll look at it anyway. So what is Team Services and what is Team Foundation Server? So there are technical tools that allow you to manage your project end-to-end, an SDLC tool. So you can start off with requirements gathering and all the way down to the release and monitoring of it once it goes out into the wild, and everything in between. So you may wonder, when it comes to the DevOps space, why would a tool like that matter? Why not just use any kind of tool to release or do it manually? And with release management and team services, well, actually with team services, it addresses the whole DevOps, because DevOps doesn't just address the building and releasing of software. People get confused and think DevOps is just the build and release of software, and that's really not what it is. It's actually the whole agile approach to doing the requirement gathering and reacting quickly to the actionable data that comes out of your builds and releases, putting that back into a pipeline that you're going to then address as you go through. So it's a way to keep agile, but at the same time constantly delivering value to your customer. And so for Team Foundation Server, the Team Services is the hosted version Microsoft offers in the cloud. Okay, Team Foundation Server is the on-premises version you can install, set up, and everything we're going to do today, you're able to do on-prem or in the cloud, either one. And you can do a mix and match hybrid setup. So when we talk about implementing DevOps, for people that are rather new to DevOps in an organization, not in the practice, but in the practice, not in the theory, what I suggest people do is start off real small and take baby steps with it. Okay, so start to get the right people and processes in place. And if you don't have those people, possibly retrain your internal people to work with you, or to hire those people that you might need to fill those gaps that you might have, if it's possible. And then putting processes in place, having some good, solid DevOps practices in place. Things like continuous integration, continuous delivery, monitoring, testing, automated testing, things like that. Getting those processes in place. Once we do that, we can then start to take advantage of some of those processes by doing things like continuous integration, like actually implementing that process into our code. Every time we're checking in our code, we should be doing an integration build probably, and maybe a release even to dev, or if that's relevant or not. But at times you may want to do a release. The other thing is starting to look at our infrastructure. Again, a lot of people think that DevOps is just about writing code and delivering it. It's also about delivering your infrastructure as code. So when we're actually doing our releases with customers, we're actually deploying their infrastructure, and then we're deploying their code to the infrastructure. Now, it may not be in every single environment that we're deploying their infrastructure every time, but we do deploy the infrastructure when there's changes made to it. So when they talk about infrastructure as code in the Microsoft world and with Azure, we are able to take that infrastructure, turn it into JSON scripts, and with release management actually deploy those JSON scripts out to Azure and stand up our whole environment end to end. Networking, servers, PaaS services, IaaS, whatever we need, we can stand up, and it's version controlled, and it's treated just like software code files are. So again, that's the next practice to get in place. And once you have that, then you can start to take advantage of a lot of the other tools that are out there. Azure development template or deployment templates, what they call ARM templates. You can start to take advantage of those, of deploying those, working with a tool called Chef. You can even use Puppet. So again, we're not just focusing on Microsoft tooling. You can use Jenkins or GitHub or Gradle or a lot of different tools out there to help you achieve that process. But I think by the time you get there, now you have some processes, you have some practice, let's start to implement some other tooling around it. So some of the good DevOps practices, I have a list here, and I like to start with continuous integration. I think first and foremost, one thing that most organizations aren't doing very well is creating continuous integration builds to at least make sure their stuff compiles together, goes into source control or is in source control, and it all works together at least. Next, I'd like to look at continuous deployment. Now that we're integrating this code, now let's try doing deployments out to our development environment and see if we can make a continuous pipeline. So what they call CI and CD. Let's create those CI builds and those CD builds and get this stuff out onto the servers. Once we get that down, then we can start to take a look at automated testing. These are the three big ones I like to look at. They're the low-hanging fruit in DevOps. Once you have it out on the servers, how can you implement some kind of automated testing practice, whether those be unit testing or maybe Selenium UI tests or whatever else you might be testing on, database testing. You can take advantage of all that in an automated fashion, and that should be your next step. Again, there's a lot of other ones on here that are really important, one of them being stakeholder participation and active stakeholder participation. If you don't have people that are actually really helping to drive this, then obviously it's not going to succeed. So it's important to make sure we have a stakeholder that cares about what's going on here. It's native cross-platform in terms of the build engine. So when we're talking release management, we actually have to have a build that's going to produce an artifact that we're going to release. We have that cross-platform now with TFS build. So I can do iOS builds against the next, an iOS machine, a Mac. I can do, again, you can see I can do a Maven or an Ant if I'm doing some Java. I have Linux scripts I can run. So that you see there's a whole bunch of different options available to us, not just Microsoft tools. So with release management, the idea is that we do our work, whether you be a devs person or an ops person, you're both writing code. And again, that's one of the cultural changes is getting ops people to think like devs and devs to start thinking like ops people. It isn't about the devs going to take over the ops person's job or vice versa. It's that they should know what each other does to some degree and include them. So for example, in our stand-ups, we include DevOps people, ops people, and we include devs, and we include project managers or testers. We include all those people in our stand-up every day because we consider them part of our team. And so they're developing their stuff and their code or their files, and they're pushing that stuff up into a source repository, which release management takes and then delivers out to a development environment, possibly staging, integration, QA, production, so on and so forth. And the value that comes out of this is the accelerated delivery, that quicker time to market. The faster you're putting this stuff into source control, the faster you're releasing it, the faster it's getting into your customers' hands. But the other thing I really like to pull out of this is MTTR, which is mean time to repair. And so mean time to repair is how fast can you recover from a disaster if one were to take place with your application. So there's a story about, and you can go look on the internet about this one, it's a company called Knight Capital. Knight Capital actually deployed their software on a Monday morning at like 9:15. And the developer forgot to code one of the configuration files correctly. So they were all done except for this one file. They put out the application, they started losing money considerably. They were a Wall Street company doing a lot of financial transactions. So they started losing all this money and they couldn't figure out how to stop it, so they shut down every single server they had. That was the only way they could stop the bleeding. It took them 45 minutes to shut down their servers. They lost $460 million. They were out of business the next day. So when you think about it, your process may not be that important or that big, but the point is that does your company is your company going to go down because your application isn't running correctly or because of a disaster that you haven't taken the time to respond to in an appropriate manner? So that's what I like to think about when I think about this whole release and DevOps practice, is that we're releasing these things and we're able to disaster recovery, and we're able to accelerate the delivery. So again, from the VSTS point of view, we can create these deployment pipelines. Like I was saying, we can have like a dev and an int, a QA. And we also have an approval workflow. So while it's really, you can say, okay, well, I can just use build and write some PowerShell and push it out to my servers. That's great, it'll deploy your stuff. But with release management and other release tools, you have the ability to get this approval workflow. Who can decide when it leaves a certain environment? Who can decide when it goes into another environment? So for example, in dev, it may automatically go into dev. Every time we do a deployment, it's going to go to dev automatically with no need for approval. But coming out of dev and into the integration environment, somebody needs to approve that actually dev is working correctly and it's ready to go to an integration environment. Then when it gets to that integration environment, somebody needs to decide, am I ready to bring this in right now? Am I ready to do that integration testing in this environment? Possibly testing other things right now and I'm not ready for it, so let's defer it. But the point is that team then decides when it comes in, and so on and so forth, letting each team make decisions as to when things go where. The other nice thing is to production. I can't release to production. I'll never be able to release to production, but there's people that can. So you give them the opportunity to be able to push those buttons and be able to get this thing into the production environment. And the nice thing too is we're applying the same thing to all stages. It's build once, deploy everywhere. So we're not recompiling for all our environments. It's compile it once and let it go. Just move it through the pipeline. And again, there's full traceability on all of this, so there's auditing of who actually let it go in and out of the environments, but when it went in and out, what went in and out. If you're using Team Foundation Server or VSTS and you're using their work item tracking system, the builds and releases will actually tell you what work items were worked on, what check-ins were associated with that build, and what went out as part of that release, and you can start to create release notes from all of this. So again, there's a lot of traceability in the tooling. So what are some of the benefits? Well, we talked about these a little bit. We talked about configuring and provisioning an environment for the infrastructure side of the house. Then obviously we want to install and configure the application. And we want to, in the testing side, create test data, automate those tests, whether they be manual or automated, and create that, seed that test data. So for example, when we deploy in our integration environment, we tear down the environment once a night, completely, infrastructure, code, everything, and redeploy it all, reseed the data, and then we deploy to it, and then we can do the testing that way. And it's done once a night. It's just a one-time a night environment deploy. But the thing is we do all those steps to make sure that we have everything fresh to go. And then the approval workflow. Obviously, that's a really important process. So I'm going to just really briefly talk on the comparison of this. In previous versions of Team Release Management, Microsoft went out and bought the tool called InRelease from a company called InCycle. And they bought it with the intention of actually rewriting this thing. So they released it as it was, which was a very big WPF, thick client, really hard to work with, kludgy application. But it did do releases and it did have a workflow. So Microsoft went back to the drawing board and decided to do a web-based, task-based approach. Whereas before, if you've worked with the build system in any previous versions of TFS, it was a Windows workflow type of setup where you'd work with Windows workflow, and it was really hard to work with. And the same thing with release management, it was really hard to work with. So those are all gone, both in the build and in the release management side of the house. Now it's cross-platform, and again, there's a lot of logging accessibility that we can get out of it now, where before with release management, logs were very difficult to get a hold of. You actually needed access to the server that it was running on to get the logs. So we don't want that all the time. So with that, talk about a hybrid release. So not everybody wants their code in the cloud. Not everybody wants to do everything in the cloud. But they want to take advantage maybe of some of the features the cloud has to offer. So what we have the ability to do is use these agents on premises that can talk to a release management in the cloud through agents, okay? And then we can actually release to our target environment because our on-prem agents can talk to both, okay? But if we're not working that way, if we don't have our on-prem agents, we can only go the hosted route, which means we can't talk back to our firewall, obviously, through our firewall to our infrastructure. But the point is I can leave and I can do most of the deployments and all the other information that I need is on-prem while I just do the release management pieces that are in the cloud, and I can take advantage of what they have to offer without shoving everything into the cloud and fully adopting VSTS in the cloud. So these are just some of the screens, and the big thing here is that we're just connecting artifacts. The builds produce artifacts, release management picks up those artifacts, and you tell it how to deploy that artifact. Traceability, here's some of that traceability we were talking about. You can see like the status of a particular build, the test results of a particular release, the test results that happen through a release, any of the work items that were worked on, who triggered it, all that type of information. You can see who did it, when they did it, things like that. So with that, let's jump into a demo. And I don't think I have any more slides to show. Whoop, that's not what I want. So this is VSTS, whether you're on-prem or in cloud, it's going to look the same. You have a project, a TFS project. Mine's called Parts Unlimited. And I'm on the home page of my project, so you can see there's a lot going on here. There's these little widgets you can add by clicking on this down here and adding a widget from the marketplace. So Visual Studio has this marketplace, and so does TFS, where you can add certain things that you might need, any features or anything. And we're going to show you how to create a new dashboard and widgets here in a minute. The first thing I want to do is look at my build. So we'll click on Build up here. And the first thing, obviously, I need to do is have a build that's going to be able to deploy the application or build the application I want to deploy. So I have a couple of builds here, but I'm going to walk through really quickly just looking at a build. Let me see, Parts Unlimited CI. So this is a CI build. And while we're not really diving into the build, I think it's important to recognize a few things with the build so you understand when you're setting it up how the release is going to work. First one is here is we have a solution we're building, and we have some build arguments in here. And these build arguments are basically that we're going to build this thing, we're going to package it up, and we're going to push this out to the build.staging directory. And that's important because that's where release management is going to go to pick up the bits, is from the build.staging directory or build.artifacts directory. So you want to make sure that your package exists there. We're packaging it as a single file, which means we're going to zip this thing up into a zip file, and release management picks up that zip file and it knows what to do with it. The other thing here is we have some automated testing going on. Nothing really fancy here. All this is saying is, hey, if you have the word test in your assembly name for your tests, it'll pick that up and see if there's any test methods it can run, and if it does, it will run them. And then we have the copy publish artifacts. So again, we're taking the artifacts that produced, and we have two of them here. One's publish, one's copy and publish. Parts Unlimited and ARM templates. Parts Unlimited is the website, ARM is the actual infrastructure templates. And we're saying, let's go put those in the build.staging directory, and we're going to include everything that's a zip file, and we'll drop that thing onto the staging directory. And for the templates, we'll just point it over to the templates directory in that drop location. We'll pull them out and we'll deploy them too. Get them all packaged up. So with that, that's really it on the builds. Does anybody have any questions? Okay. So let's go to the release side of the house. Then I'll come back and run a build here and let you see it. So I have my Parts Unlimited release, and I can create a new release by going up here and creating a new release definition. And it gives me some templates that I can use, but again, if I'm not starting with an Azure deployment of any type, I can just click an empty release definition. It's going to ask me, okay, where your artifact's going to come from. Mine's going to come from the build, but you can see you have other options available to you. We're going from the Parts Unlimited project. We're using the parts.ci build, and I can change this one to the Parts Unlimited CI build. We're going to use this as a continuous deployment. So what that means is basically when I finish a build successfully, do you want to automatically deploy it every time as part of this? And so that'll then do the automated deployment. I don't have to set that up, but I will for this one. And then what agent do I want to use for my build or for my release? I'm going to use the hosted agent. We're going to create that. And what it does is basically give me the skeleton here where I can start to add tasks to it. And it gives me one environment to start with. So what I like to do is rename that to dev. Go in here and add some tasks. Like, what is this thing going to need to do? Well, I want to deploy an infrastructure to Azure. So they have this infrastructure Azure Resource Group deployment. So I'm going to add that. And then I'm going to want to deploy a web application. So I'm going to do this Azure Web App deployment. So what this deployment task does, this Azure Resource Deployment, is basically take our infrastructure and deploy it out to Azure in a resource group. So in Azure, you used to have what they call cloud services, and everything was like a container for all your pieces in Azure for each project, kind of. In the new version of Azure, what they call V2 Azure, you have what they call resource groups. And those resource groups contain all your infrastructure, PaaS, IaaS, databases, servers, networking, all that stuff. So this is going to go out there and it's going to take my infrastructure, create a resource group, and deploy my infrastructure into that resource group. And all I have to do is give it a subscription I want to work with. And I want to create a resource group here. If I already have one, it'll pick it up. And I already have one out there in Azure. Where's my template I want to use? And I come over here. And as part of my drop location, I've already run this. It will actually pick up the JSON file that I want to deploy with. And then we have this idea of a parameters file. So when we're working with the Azure templates as part of our infrastructure, we have what they call the main JSON template that tells everything that's going to happen. And then these parameter files that pass in the values for those particular services or IaaS machines you're going to deploy. So maybe this parameter file contains the names of virtual machines or the names of web apps or things like that for each environment. So I'll just tell it what parameter file to use. And what's nice about this is that allows you to create one template for the Azure stuff and then multiple parameter files. So you're not managing a whole bunch of template files, you're managing a whole bunch of parameter files that deploy, and the architecture is always the same every single time. So we got that set. We go to the Azure deployment piece, and we have to select a subscription that we're going to work with for Azure. And again, if you have MSDN and you haven't played around with your Azure benefits, I would suggest that you look at that because everybody gets like $200 a month or $150 a month in Azure benefits free. So you can go out and do quite a bit with that. I mean, that's what I use for all my demos and everything I do to practice with. And it never goes over. I never pay for it. Web app location, again, I'm going to put mine in East US. This is wherever Microsoft has data centers. We got to give it a web app name. That's a drop-down, but it shouldn't be because actually it doesn't show anything when you push the drop-down button, ever. So we're going to call this Parts Unlimited Code on Beach. And then we have this thing called slots. So the idea is with slots is, I'm not sure if people are familiar with slots, but what a slot does is allows you to push your code into, it's the same bit of code, but it allows you to push code into a particular slot. Let's say a QA slot and a production slot, or pre-prod and production slot. What it does is it allows you to take and swap those slots at some point in time, and you swap those slots, and it allows you to then take what was in pre-prod and have it in production. If in fact it's not working correctly in production or you find something wrong, you just swap the slots back, and what was production is now back to production. And so it really allows for you to recover quickly while you're going through. And so we use deployment slots a lot of times for that type of thing. And then we have a web deploy package, and we're going to call this our web application. There's our zip file we create, and so and that's pretty much it. We can save this. It triggers. Got to select the build because we said continuous deployment. And then I got to go up here and change the name if I want. So let's go back and take a look. That's a pretty basic setup. Let's go look at the Parts Unlimited one I already have set up. You can see here I've added more stages to it, or more environments. By going up here and adding an environment, I can quickly add them. But what's nice is I set up my development environment as I wanted it, with an infrastructure deployment and a web deployment, okay? And then what I do is I go over to here and I say, let's clone this environment. So once I have the first one set up, I clone the rest of them and take out the pieces I need and add in anything else or change some variables or whatever it is I need. So I'm not recreating these things from scratch every single time. I just make the first one like I want it and then clone it for all the others. I can then, once I have that all cloned and set up, what I did is I came in here and I actually overrode the template parameters. So for my Azure deployment, my infrastructure deployment, we have that parameters file. Well, the way that we've set it up here is we don't actually put values in the parameter file, we just put the parameter names in there. And then what we do is we create these variables, which are environment specific, by going to here, configure variables. And these environment variables contain all the parameters that need to be passed into that ARM template, okay? And I have the ability to put passwords in there with this little lock so I can show and hide passwords. And that's a 256-bit encrypted over-the-wire password, so you don't have to really worry about somebody, you know, on transport stealing this thing, and for any reason. It's pretty well secure. And then what I do is I just go in here and I replace those values right here. So they're kind of like website, and then there's my parameter name, website name up here, and the server name, and things like that. So I'm basically overriding whatever's in that template. And then on the deployment side of the house, everything's still the same, except I'm deploying the dev to a dev slot. The next thing I want to do is once I have it set up, I have my environments kind of where I want them to be, and I'll show you the staging. We pull out the infrastructure one. I've got dev, I'm deploying in slots. I don't need to deploy because it's deploying to the same server in different slots. I'm just going to tell it, you know, don't deploy infrastructure again, just deploy the web application. Okay, and the same thing with production. So once I have that set up, I want to go and assign approvers. So what this is basically showing us here is that for pre-deployment, I'm going to automatically go into that particular environment, dev. Okay? And then on the post, or after it's done deploying, I want to be able to assign specific users or groups to be able to push this thing out of that dev environment and on its way to the staging environment. And I want to send an email to the approver to let him know, him or her know, you know, you have something waiting for you in your queue. And then I'll do the same thing with staging, except that I won't allow it to be automated in any way, shape, or form. You have to approve it to come in, you have to approve it to go out, and the same thing again for production. Once we have that all in place, we should be able to do a deployment with some deployment gate or some approval gates. So what I want to do is go back to the build and actually run a build and let it kick off a deployment. There's a couple ways you can run the build. I can have a continuous integration build, which I can very easily go into my code, make a change, save it, and it'll actually push it out to the build, push it out through release management, and automatically deploy this thing. Or I could come in here, right-click on this, and select Queue Build. It just depends on how I want to do it, if I want it to be manual or automated. So I'm going to go to my code and see if we can change something in my code real quick here. So Microsoft has this really cool code editor called Visual Studio Code, and it allows me to modify some of my code files right here in the browser. So if I go to the web application and I go to Views, and I go to Home, man, this mouse does not work on there. And I go to Index, it's going to open up. Come on. I think you are. Oh. There it goes. Sure, it's taking a minute. Well, I'll let that go, and then we can come back and show it again and doing an automated one. For now, I'll go into the builds, and I will right-click and I'll queue this new build just to show you how the build is going to work. So basically it's going to ask me again, what queue do I want to use? I'm going to use my hosted queue. I have a couple of variables I can replace down here if I want to. So right now I'm doing a release in any CPU. I could very easily change this to a debug build. And then again, any CPU will work. System.debug, I have it set to false right now. What that means is if the build were to fail, for example, and I want to have a little more verbose output, a little more information to tell me maybe why it failed, I can set that to true. And it'll give me a more verbose output for me to kind of diagnose what's going on. I usually keep it at false because I don't need all that logging to start with. So I'll queue that build. And what's real nice, again, if you ever looked at the old build engine, this is nothing like it. I've got this real-time logging available to me. It's gonna tell me where we're at every step of the way, what's happening in that particular step as it's going through. So like we see right now, we've actually initialized the agent. It's gonna take a minute here, and it'll start to build. You'll see it load up all the steps we're gonna go through. So those are the steps we have in our particular build definition that we set up. We're doing our NuGet restore, and then we're going to actually go out and build a solution, and then we'll run some tests. And tests are interesting because you're going to approach it two different ways. If the tests fail, you may want to fail the build completely, and that might be, how it has to work. But you can also say to continue on error with your tests, and if tests fail, the build will still run. You'll just get a report back that says these builds failed, or these tests failed, but your build still ran on, and we're going to, instead of succeeding the build, we'll partially succeed it. And that's what will take place here. When we run ours, you'll see the tests actually fail some of the tests. So there it goes, it's failing some of those tests, it's passing other ones, and it's moving on to the publishing the symbols, if we need to debug symbols and have a symbol server. And then publishing those artifacts out now for the website, and now publishing ARM templates, and we've partially succeeded. So we can go into the build summary, we can take a look at it. You can see I got some code coverage down here. I have some test results. It tells me what passed, what failed, what my percentages are. Over here, it tells me these are the associated changes that went into this particular build. So what it does is it looks at the prior build that you ran in this build, and it says, oh, you've worked on all these commits since the last build. Oh, and if you associated the work items, those will show up in your list too. And then down here, if you had any deployments, it would show the deployments down here. So with that, I'm going to flip over to the release, because we ran a build, and you can see we have a release actually working for us right now. Oh, it's running both my COB and my parts unlimited. I think the COB will fail. Let's look at this one. So it's in progress. And there it was kicked off when the build got done, and it's out there and it's deploying out to the dev environment. We can go to the logs, see what's taking place out there. So it deployed it's downloading the artifacts, and it's actually deploying the Azure. So what it's doing is basically creating or updating. That's the way I set up this step, is either create the infrastructure if it doesn't exist, or if it does, just update it with any changes you may find in my template. Obviously there's no changes here, so this shouldn't take too long to run. And then it'll do the actual Azure deployment. And that will deploy the application right out onto the infrastructure we just deployed. Any questions on any of this? Okay. Well, that's doing that. Let's go back to our code and see if we can make a change to one of these, or if it already, I've got to go through it all again. Well, let's see. So there it's doing the deployment out to Azure now. See, it's and it's got the parts unlimited.web, and that's what this is down here. Get the website and do the deployment. And at some point here it'll finish, and it'll prompt us for an approval step. We can either approve or reject it at this point in time. So you don't have to, while development might be building all the time, you don't have to release all those builds out into an environment. So you have the ability to reject these builds at any point in time. So maybe there's 4 of them sitting there for dev, but only one of them you care about. You can go ahead and you can reject it. So what it does is it's basically emailed me right now, and I should get an email any second. I'll see it come up here. And I can then approve or reject it for the post-deployment. Or I can even reassign it. So maybe I'm not the one that's going to be responsible for this anymore, so I'm going to reassign it to somebody until they can update that, or I just want to reassign it to another person because I don't have the time to take care of this right now. I can do that. In this case, I'm going to approve it. I could say, ready for stage, approve it. And it'll automatically give me another approval step right away. And what it's basically stating is, okay, now that you've gone out of dev, we need to approve this thing to come into the staging environment. It's the same dialogue, just a little different. In this case, we have a defer this deployment to. So what's really nice is I'm not ready for this in the environment yet, but I want to defer it for a certain date or time. I can very easily do that. I can very easily just sit in the queue, and when I'm ready to bring it in, I'll approve it at that point in time. Or again, I could turn around and reject it outright. So I'm just going to approve it. Ready to go. And it's just going to walk through the exact same steps again, but in the staging environment. And the whole idea here is that we have an automated process that's repeatable in every single stage we put into our definition. Okay, we don't have to worry about is one environment different than the other environment? Is one application running differently than another? It's all the same in all environments. So if I go out to my Azure, show you kind of what it looks like from the Azure point of view. Because we want to see that this thing is actually out there. Oop, personal. Should just go right in. Okay, yeah. So this is the Azure Dashboard. And I'm going to go to resource groups, because that's what I'm creating here. Is a resource group. There's my Parts Unlimited resource group. And you see we have these blades, these things they call blades. Every time it opens a new window, it's called a blade in Azure. So in this blade, we have our infrastructure. So this is all that I deployed with that script, that template, is I basically have the web application. I have a service plan associated with that, which we need. I have a database. I have some application insights, which is monitoring of the application once it's been deployed. And so all that stuff got created as part of that template I had. So if I go to the Parts Unlimited web, again, I'll open up a new blade. And it'll give me a URL that I'll be able to go out to. And usually it's some url.azurewebsites.net. Needs to be distinct, so when we put in our web app name, it needs to be a distinct name throughout Azure. So let it do its thing there. In the meantime, let's go to here and approve this one to go out of stage. And then we'll approve it for production and let it run in production. Oops, I think I just rejected it. Oh well, that's okay. We can run another one. Let's go back to our home page here, and there we are. We're up and running. Okay, now I can also go into here and type in dev, because I'm really redeploying the application. I'm taking the same application, I'm putting it in each slot. So what it does is it turns the URL into a -dev, -stage, whatever your slot name is. So I'm basically just have to put dev on the end of my DNS entry, or my web app entry, and then it'll go out to there. So now we're going to switch over to the dev instance. So dev and prod could be different, or dev and stage could be different. So you might do some changes in dev and you want to see them, you deploy them to the dev slot, you test it out, see if they're all working right, or you deploy it out to production and realize, hey, it doesn't look the way we thought it would, let's switch slots back, or swap slots. So that's really how you do all that. I closed down my Visual Studio. Let's go back up. So let's go back to the code and see if we can actually get this thing to actually auto-deploy, because I'd like to show you that. So go to the website. There we go. So like I say, we have this Visual Studio Editor now, this browser-based editing that's available. So and it's not for writing code, it's actually for just making changes and things like that. You know, you're not gonna write C# code in the browser yet. So we're gonna call this a home page. Come on. Man, this mouse is awful on this thing. Oh, I gotta put edit, I'm sorry. That's why it's not working. Go to edit. We'll change it, we'll save it, and that'll automatically do a commit. It'll actually tell you that I just did a commit because I'm using Git, I'm not using TF version control, I'm using Git here. And it automatically did a commit, and now when I go back over to my build tab, I should see my build being kicked off. So I go to queued, there's my queued build, and it's going through that whole process once again. I just made some changes, let it go. And again, this is what you should be trying to achieve with that release management, is get that continuous integration going. Every time I check in code, I should be able to do a build, not necessarily release it, but I should be able to build it and make sure that it all works together.
Paul, did you say what is included in your continuous integration, like what you're actually doing in there?
Yeah, sure. So that's kind of what I was looking at here. I didn't go too heavy into the build, but what we're doing is we're running some unit tests, and we're doing our NuGet restore. We're running some unit tests, and we're just packaging and publishing this thing. This is more of a CD than a CI build. But for a CI build, you probably wouldn't. May or may not run tests. You probably wouldn't be packaging it up and deploying it and getting ready for deployment, obviously, because that's not the type of build that it is. You really want some really quick, fast-running builds here. So, for example, I may remove, let's go over to the build. I may take out this package part here. You know, we really don't need it. We just need to make sure this thing compiles together and it'll work and it succeeds. And our unit tests run and they're good too. But again, if you have check-ins happening at a frequency like this, maybe unit testing is not important at that point in time. You can do it during the integration build at night, for example, or have testers, developers do testing locally before they check it in. There's always solutions to that. So you could actually go in here and take out this particular step and say, I'm not going to even run tests. We're just going to run a build, make sure it compiles, and then work with it from there. So go back to the release again real quick. And what I want to look at is, we just kind of showed you how to set up a release pretty quickly. What I want to look at is the artifacts that are associated with this. So we looked at the environment, we looked at the steps we set up. But there's artifacts. So this is how I connected to a particular build. Now, when I first set it up, I said that I was going to use this particular build. But again, we can do link an artifact source. We can add another artifact in here if we wanted to. So what's nice is you're not tied to just the output of one build. So where this comes in handy is, for example, we use Artifactory, which is a binary repository. And if you haven't heard of a binary repository, it's a way for us to version control basically our third-party DLLs or even our internal DLLs that we want to use as part of an application. So in our binary repository, we have different versions of binaries that we want associated with particular releases. So what I can do here is I can create a build. I create a build for those particular binaries. Especially for our in-house ones, not third-party obviously, but our in-house ones. And then I can tell it, here, go pick up this particular build because it's got this version of the binary I need, and the other one's got the right, infrastructure binary or notification binary or whatever it is. We can add different builds into here, so when we're deploying, we're not just deploying an application and an infrastructure, we're deploying all the right versions of all the application pieces that we need to deploy. So you're not bound to just one artifact in here. The thing is you have to have multiple builds though, because it's associated with a build. Then the variables we looked at a little bit. Here we're using global variables as compared to the variables we showed you were environment specific. These are global variables, so what I'm basically stating here is that for every one of those environments we go to, production stage and dev, the website name is going to be this. We change that website name by using the slots. Again, how do you want to release this thing? Whether it be a manual release, again, we can have a scheduled or continuous. Scheduled is pretty straightforward. Select it, and you can do time, dates, things like that. And then you have environment triggers down here that tell you from when and how they deploy. So for example, in dev, I click on this, and it's going to pop up this deployment conditions. And what this basically says is we can trigger this thing after a release creation. So once the release is created, I want you to go and deploy this thing right away. Now, in other ones, we'll take a look and we'll see how you can use some other options here. And then we're going to allow multiple releases to be deployed at the same time if we like. Or we can say just one deployment at a time. All depends on how you got your set up. So then what I do is I go into the staging. It's a little different. This one I'm saying after I successfully deploy to the dev environment, then can you kick off the staging one? And after all the approvals have been set up and everything, can you actually deploy? And what I can actually do is actually trigger a partial deployment. So a partially succeeded deployment is similar to a partially succeeded build. It deployed, but something in there failed. Okay, and you may want to still deploy that, but again, by default, I don't set it. General is just what revision number. Retention policies, how many of these do we want to keep around? So again, for my production, I want to keep a minimum of 3 releases around. Whether or not I want to retain the build associated with that particular release. So I could say for the production environment, let's keep that build around too. We want to make sure we don't get rid of that because we may need it again. So we'll save that. And then lastly, we have the history here. And what's nice with history is, and this is really new, and you can do this in build definitions and release definitions now, is I have the ability to select these. So let's select this one and this one. I don't know why this always messes up on me, but it does. So let's just do it this way. Let's see if I can do it like this. Okay, and do a diff on them. Oop, it didn't select it. See, I don't know why it does that, but let's see if we can still diff it. It'll diff. And so what it's basically going to do is allow me to look at each particular release definition and say, or build definition for that matter, and decide what changes were made in this thing. So we went from revision 9 to revision 10. We modified date, obviously changed. But what else has changed on this? And if I go down here on the bottom, I can see this little red box down here. And what that means is there's a change down there. And everywhere there's a change in the file, I'll see a little red marker. I can just click on those and go to that change. And what this is basically saying is I changed the trigger. I changed the trigger from there to here. And those are the changes. And then I actually added a comment. Changed it to a CI release. So if I go back here, you can see I have my comment in here. You can see who changed it, when they changed it. So this is really huge compared to what Microsoft used to do because there was no auditing. People would go in and change your build definitions on you if they had proper rights, and you never know who changed it, why they changed it, or what they changed, and then you're trying to figure out how did the build break. So now at least we have some idea of what's going on in there. Any questions on that? Okay. The other thing we get to do now with this is a really new feature, I think it just came out last week, is let's say I have an extensive list of steps here. Let's say I have 10 or 15 steps. But 3 of those steps are the same in every single environment that I'm going to deploy to all the time. Okay? What I can do is I can select these and I can do what they call a meta task. So it's actually, I got to select them and right click on it. Let's go to here. I can create what we call a meta task out of this by right-clicking on it, selecting them, the steps included, create a meta task. What this basically does is it takes that particular step or steps and makes it into a single step that you just drop into your release as a task step that you can select from your dialog. So we can call this one COB, and we're going to put it in the deploy category. That's how it'll show up in the steps dialog, and we'll create it. Now we have it. Now if I went to add tasks and we selected deploy, you can see there's a meta task there. Here's my COB task. I can very easily add it to the other release definitions that I have out there. And so what I can do then is go to the meta tasks to manage it. And in the meta tasks, I can go into the tasks themselves, and I can see, what are the steps that I added. And I can add new tasks to it. I can remove them. I can change them, whatever the case may be. And this is for the Azure one. I got the COB one here. You can see it's pretty similar, same thing. And then some of the properties, again, I can go in here and I can change some of the values here if I need to. So with that, go back to the release again. The other thing I want to look at now is go back to the home page. So I was talking to somebody this morning or last night about this. Wouldn't it be really cool if I just knew what was in what environment, what release was in what environment right from the dashboard? And these are the dashboards that you can create. So this is our default dashboard, like I showed you when we first got out into VSTS, is this dashboard. But what I want to do is I like to create a different dashboard for build and release. And in my build and release dashboard, I'm going to go down and I'm going to select some widgets by highlighting on that pencil thing and clicking here. And this allows me to go out into the marketplace. And the marketplace has all these different extensions you can add either to VSTS or TFS for functionality enhancements or widgets that give you information. This adds the widgets here. So I'm going to add the chart for builds, and then I'm going to go in here and add it. So now I'm going to have a build history chart here. Let that widget configure. While that's doing that, I'm going to go to the releases. And in this little drop down there next to the release, I want to go down and add it to the dashboard, build and release. Okay, so let's go back to our dashboard real quick. And what's really nice is let it do its configuration stuff here. I'm going to be able to see the history of my builds, and I can see my releases, what's in what environment, what versions in what environment, where they at in the pipeline process. So I can actually click on that particular release in Dev, and it's going to take me out there to the release definition and show you that we have something pending there, needs approval, whatever the case may be. So I have that ability to create those dashboards really easily. And then I want to show you the build one too. Let's see if it's configured yet. It's still doing its thing. Oh, I got to select a definition. Okay. Let's do parts unlimited. And again, these are like live tiles, so I can go in and click on these things, and they're gonna take me somewhere. So like here, I can see here's the build. Again, I click on that one particular build we just ran, and I can see that here's our build definition. And by the way, now we have some releases or deployments associated with that where we didn't before, and you can see the status of them, where they're at, things like that. So with that, I'm trying to jump back to some slides real quick here. I think unless people have questions, I'm going to jump into the slides here and basically start wrapping up. I think we're getting about that time anyway. So we looked at the build, we looked at the release, and how you set those up, how you can configure a build to some degree and release that, how we can set up the continuous integration, how we can deploy our infrastructure, not only our code but our infrastructure. And with that, I think I'm just going to wrap up here and thank you all for coming. And if you have any questions or you want to see me afterwards, that's fine. Come see me. Or again, you can email me or reach me on Twitter at PJHacker. Like I said, I have this presentation already pre-canned. If people are interested in it, just get me on Twitter on a message or through my email, and I'll make sure you get this and the slide deck. They're both available for you afterwards. So I appreciate it. Thank you very much, everybody.